In the shadowed hollows of the Kentucky River, a whisper traveled among the willows. Something waits beneath the water, and it keeps what it takes. In 1826, a widow named Eleanor Ashcroft lived at the edge of these waters, her mansion rotting, her wealth tied to human lives. She had inherited not just land, but a secret, a pact her husband had kept buried, involving the river itself. On moonless nights, the water shivered as if alive, and locals swore they saw faces in its currents, pleading or laughing. They could not tell which. Eleanor, desperate to preserve her fortune and her family's legacy, made a choice no one could have foreseen. She sold her slaves, not to another plantation, but to the river spirits she believed dwelled beneath the black tide. Would you have traded souls for survival, or run screaming into the dark? In the spring of 1826, the Ashcroft estate loomed over the Kentucky River like a decaying sentinel. The mansion was built of dark oak and limestone, its shutters rattling in the wind, the paint peeling as if repelled by the very air. Eleanor Ashcroft, now in her early 40s, walked the long hallways alone, her skirts whispering across the cold wooden floors. She had inherited the estate after her husband's sudden death, an inheritance heavy with land, money, and people who had been considered property. The slaves on the estate, men, women, and children, lived under strict orders, tending the fields and livestock, cooking, cleaning, their lives measured in work and obedience. Eleanor's husband had been cruel, but Eleanor's mind was sharper, colder. She understood the weight of ownership differently. She could not ignore the creeping debts, the failing crops, and the rumors of rebellion stirring in neighboring counties. Every night, she stared across the river, its waters black and gleaming under the moonlight, and felt a presence there, a silent intelligence that waited. The river, the locals whispered, was not ordinary. It had long been feared for its shifting tides and sudden whirlpools, but Eleanor learned that it held secrets deeper than currents. Her husband, before his death, had spoken of old legends, spirits who claimed the souls of the willing, spirits who could protect fortunes or punish those who tried to cheat them. Many dismissed it as superstition, yet Eleanor could not. She saw the way the water seemed to glow faintly under sight and moon phases, watched the ripples form patterns like words, and felt an undeniable pull, an understanding that some debts could not be paid with coin alone. Eleanor's mind began to turn on a dangerous axis. The estate's finances were failing. The river whispered promises, protection, security, prosperity, but it demanded payment, and the only currency she had was human lives. One evening, after the servants had finished their work, she approached the riverbank, shivering in the damp night air, clutching a ledger of debts and a list of the enslaved she could offer. The water lapped eagerly at the stones, as though aware of her presence. That night, Eleanor Ashcroft made a choice that would haunt the Kentucky River for decades. She would sell her slaves, not to a trader, not to another plantation, but to the spirits who lived beneath the black water. And the river waited, patient, hungry, and ancient. The night Eleanor Ashcroft approached the riverbank, the air was thick with fog, carrying the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic, like iron warmed in a fire. The Kentucky River churned softly under the pale moonlight, its surface unnaturally still in places, reflecting the blackness of the sky. She had brought offerings, a silver coin from her husband's hidden hoard, a small vial of her own blood, and a list of the enslaved people whose fates she intended to bind to the water. Eleanor whispered into the night, invoking the names of the spirits her husband had feared. The river responded with a subtle hiss, like steam curling from a cauldron, though no fire had been lit. The reeds trembled as if the river itself had heard her words. She knelt on the cold stones and pressed the ledger to the water, dipping the silver coin beneath the surface. The current tightened around it, swallowing it with a wet, sucking sound. Eleanor gasped at the sensation. The water felt alive, crawling across her fingers, tugging at the page. Then she heard it, voices, low and melodic, weaving through the mist. They were not human voices, nor entirely foreign. "We see," they whispered. "We take. We give." Eleanor felt the fear rise in her chest, yet her resolve hardened. She began naming the enslaved aloud, offering each soul to the river in exchange for protection, prosperity, and security for her family and estate. Each name she spoke was accompanied by a ripple in the water, rising unnaturally, the surface trembling as though acknowledging the pact. The voices grew louder, almost chanting. Eleanor felt a sharp sting on her hand. Her blood, drawn from the small cut she had made earlier, mixed with the river water. The current swirled violently around the ledger, the coin, and her fingers. She could feel a pulse, slow and measured, as if the river itself was breathing. When the final name was spoken, the river calmed, leaving an eerie silence that pressed into her ears. Eleanor stepped back, shivering, her palms slick with water and blood. She knew the spirits had accepted her offer. The river had claimed them. No one saw the enslaved again. At dawn, the estate seemed quieter than ever, but wealth and crops flourished in impossible ways. Eleanor understood the price she had paid, and the power she now wielded. Yet deep in her dreams, she heard the river's voice again, reminding her, ever so softly, "We remember. We wait. We take in time." The pact was made, but the river's hunger had only begun. In the weeks following the pact, whispers began to circulate among the few remaining workers on the Ashcroft estate. They spoke of shadows that moved without source, figures glimpsed out of the corner of the eye, vanishing when looked at directly. Eleanor dismissed their fears as superstition, but deep down, she knew better. The river had claimed her offer, and its power was now present in every dark corner of the estate. At night, the river seemed to pulse, a living heartbeat visible through the fog. The estate dogs refused to approach its banks, howling mournfully when forced to cross the threshold. Cats slinked away, ears flattened, hissing at nothing. Even the trees along the shoreline seemed to bend toward the water, branches twitching as though listening. The first incident occurred when a young field hand, Samuel, vanished while fetching water from the well near the river's edge. His mother's frantic cries drew Eleanor herself to the spot. She saw nothing, only the water, shimmering unnaturally, reflecting moonlight in uneven patterns. Yet she felt it, a presence beneath the surface, a gaze that pierced the soul. Samuel was gone, leaving only a faint ripple that dissolved into silence. Soon, more servants disappeared. Each time, Eleanor noticed subtle signs, a waterlogged footprint appearing far from the river, a silver spoon floating mid-air before dropping to the ground, and faint whispers carried on the wind in tones too low for normal hearing. The estate began to feel hollow, haunted not by ghosts of the dead, but by a force that remembered its bargain. Neighbors reported strange occurrences as well. Lights would flicker along the riverbank at night, accompanied by a faint singing, melodic but unnatural. Travelers who tried to cross the river swore they saw figures standing on the water, waiting, sometimes beckoning. Those who dared speak of it were labeled crazy, or wise, disappeared without a trace. Eleanor, despite her wealth, began to understand that the pact was not a one-time transaction. The river required attention, payment, and ritual. Each life claimed, each whispered name, seemed to draw it closer to the estate itself. One night, Eleanor stood on the shore, clutching a candle, watching the black water ripple. In its depth, she saw a reflection of herself, not as she was, but twisted, pale, and stretched like smoke in the current. A voice whispered clearly for the first time, "We come for the next. We come for all." And Eleanor realized the shadows she had ignored were not merely the absence of light. They were the first wave of the river's claim. By mid-1826, the Kentucky River no longer appeared merely as water. It had become a maw. Eleanor Ashcroft's estate, once vibrant, now quivered with the presence of the unseen. The fog rolled off the river thick and slow, carrying the coppery scent of blood and damp earth. The air itself seemed to vibrate with low, harmonic hums that resonated from the depths. Those who lingered too close at night reported a faint tug on their ankles, as though the river reached out for flesh, testing its will. The first major feeding occurred after Eleanor hosted a small gathering of merchants, curious about her sudden prosperity. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, the river rose unnaturally. A violent swirl appeared near the shore, hissing and spitting as if boiling from the inside. The partygoers, oblivious, drank wine and praised Eleanor's fortune, until screams split the air. Men and women were dragged toward the churning water with terrifying swiftness. The current gripped them like iron hands. Eleanor stood at the riverbank, powerless yet complicit. The water swallowed half a dozen souls in minutes, and when it calmed, only ripples remained, reflecting a pale moon that seemed stranger than before. Not a body safest, not a sound remained, but the silence was heavier, pregnant with something lurking just beneath. The river had accepted its due. It was a living ledger, and Eleanor now saw it in horrifying clarity. Each life she offered, Each name she whispered into the night, fed it. Its hunger was insatiable, yet its appetite refined, claiming only the chosen. Even livestock left near the riverbank vanished. Sheep, cows, and horses were found days later, unnaturally clean and eerily still, eyes wide as if in silent testimony. Neighbors dared not approach, and travelers avoided the region entirely. Stories began to form, whispered along country roads. The widow Ashcroft had struck a dark bargain, trading human lives for fortune, and the river now demanded more. Children told of faces in the water, eyes glinting like polished coal, mouths moving as if chanting prayers. Eleanor, despite her wealth, felt the first tremors of fear. The river's feast was not yet complete, and she understood it demanded acknowledgement. Every ripple was a reminder, every whisper a call. And in the darkest hours of night, she could hear the water itself laughing, a hollow, ancient sound that promised the next offering. The feast had begun, and the river would not forget. By late 1826, the Ashcroft estate had become an island of dread in the rolling hills of Kentucky. The river's power was no longer hidden. It pulsed visibly in the black water, glowing faintly under the moon and exhaling mist that clung to trees like cobwebs. Villagers who once traded at Eleanor's estate now avoided it, whispering of disappearances and strange singing on the wind. They crossed the river farther upstream or détoured entirely, leaving the estate isolated. Merchants and travelers told stories of servants walking into the fog, vanishing mid-step. The few who dared approach the estate reported seeing shadows rising from the water, gliding over the ground, bending around the house like sentient smoke. Children refused to leave their homes after dusk, claiming the river called to them. Even the county officials hesitated. Sheriff Daniel Corbett had initially attempted to investigate the estate but returned pale and silent, claiming only, "The water. It does not forgive. It remembers every debt." Those who pressed for details found Corbett wandering riverside, muttering names no one recognized, before he vanished one night into the mist, never to be seen again. Meanwhile, Eleanor Ashcroft's fortune continued to grow. Crops flourished against all odds, her cattle thrived, and her wealth multiplied. Yet no one could see her prosperity without sensing the dark price behind it. Servants were gone, merchants whispered of unnatural bargains, and travelers recounted glimpses of ghostly figures gliding on the water, yet none dared to challenge the widow. Locals began to speak of the estate in hushed tones. "The widow Ashcroft thrives, but her soul walks with the river," they said. They avoided the riverbank, never speaking her name aloud, fearing it might draw her attention, or worse, the river's. When fishermen lost nets or saw eerie faces beneath the surface, the story spread like wildfire. Even the animals refused the water. Horses balked, dogs whimpered at the edge of the river, and birds avoided the trees near the estate. Every life around the river seemed marked with avoidance, as if the river's claim extended beyond human beings alone. The town had turned away, abandoning curiosity and courage alike. They whispered of a widow who had bartered human souls with river spirits and left the county to fear what came next. Yet the river waited, patient, eternal, and hungry, and Eleanor knew that isolation was only the beginning of the river's reckoning. By early 1827, the river began demanding more than Eleanor Ashcroft had initially offered. The spirits beneath its dark currents were no longer satisfied with the occasional human life. They required acknowledgement, ritual, and obedience. Eleanor woke each morning to the faint scent of iron in the air and the low murmur of voices caroling through the mist. At first, she believed it was her imagination, but the estate's servants, the few who remained, began to vanish one by one. The toll began subtly. A cow disappeared from the pasture. A child was found wandering near the riverbank, wet and silent, eyes staring blankly into the fog. Then, one evening, Eleanor found a silver platter floating mid-air above the river, spinning slowly as though guided by unseen hands. The water hissed as it touched the platter's edge, leaving bane marks on the stones. Eleanor realized the spirits were not bound to the river alone. They could extend their influence across land and air, bending reality to their will. She tried leaving offerings, coins, blood, scraps of her own hair, but the spirits required something deeper. Each disappeared soul left an imprint on her conscience, a growing awareness that the river's claim was eternal. Local travelers reported seeing figures, half-seen shapes that glimmered beneath the water's surface, moving like smoke. Some claimed these figures mimicked the enslaved souls Eleanor had offered, dancing slowly in the mist before sinking again into the depths. Others swore they heard chanting, a low, harmonious resonance that seemed to come from the riverbed itself. One night, Eleanor knelt on the bank and whispered into the water, begging for leniency. The river responded with a violent swell, soaking her skirts and chilling her to the bone. From the depths, a voice, neither male nor female, intoned, "The debt is remembered. The toll is taken. The feast is eternal." Eleanor understood then that the spirits were not merely guardians or collectors. They were predators, ancient and patient, bound to the river and its darkness. Her wealth, her lands, and even her very survival were now inseparable from the river's will. By dawn, a mist hung thick over the estate. Eleanor Ashcroft stood trembling, pale, and soaked, knowing that she had initiated a bond that could never be broken. The spirits had accepted her bargain, but at a cost she had yet to fully comprehend. And in the shadowed currents, the river whispered again, promising the next toll. By the summer of 1827, the nights along the Kentucky River had changed. Darkness no longer arrived as a quiet curtain, but as a living presence, thick and suffocating. The estate, once lively with the sounds of wind in the trees or distant livestock, fell into unnatural silence. Windows rattled as though something pressed against them from the outside, yet nothing could be seen. Shadows lengthened beyond reason, moving independently of the moon's light. Eleanor Ashcroft began to notice a pattern. Satan nights, the darkness itself seemed to pull away from the river, extending across her fields. Livestock would vanish, crops would wither, and servants, those few who had not yet disappeared, were found wandering at dawn, pale, trembling, sometimes whispering in voices not their own. Travelers passing the river spoke of the disappearing nights, periods when the stars vanished and even the moon refused to rise. On such nights, the river glowed faintly from beneath its black surface, casting ripples of molten gold that crawled along the banks like liquid fire. Some claimed to see faces embedded in the water, eyes fixed on the land, mouths forming silent chants. Eleanor tried to protect herself. She lit dozens of candles along the shore, arranged charms she had read about in old books, and spoke prayers into the wind. Yet when darkness fell, it swallowed everything. Even within her own home, she could feel the river pressing against the walls, tugging at the doors, reaching toward her bedroom with invisible hands. One particularly harrowing night, she awoke to find her own reflection missing from the water basin in her chamber. Instead, a pale, twisted version of herself stared up at her, lips moving silently as though rehearsing some unholy sermon. Eleanor fled to the riverbank, clutching a lantern, only to see the water shimmer and coalesce into shapes, half human, half liquid, dancing in slow, rhythmic motions. They whispered her name, calling her to join them beneath the current. By dawn, the estate was quieter than ever. The servants who remained were too terrified to speak, and Eleanor herself began to tremble even in daylight. She realized that the river's claim was not only over the souls she had offered, it was spreading, corrupting the nights themselves, twisting time, and bending reality around her. The nights would continue to disappear, one by one, until the river had consumed all that it had ever chosen. And Eleanor understood, with a shiver that ran to her bones, there was no escaping the river, and the spirit's feast was far from over. By autumn of 1827, whispers of the Kentucky River had reached neighboring counties. Travelers spoke of a place where the water shimmered unnaturally under the moon, and of a widow whose estate was cloaked in perpetual mist. Yet the true horror lay beneath the surface, the souls Eleanor Ashcroft had offered to the river spirits. Those who vanished were never seen again, yet the estate bore their mark. Crops flourished as if nourished by more than soil, animals grew larger and healthier, but shadows moved where no light fell, and faint laughter echoed in empty holes. The water itself seemed to carry voices, soft cries, half singing, half pleading, so faint that one could mistake them for wind through the trees. Eleanor sometimes dared to approach the river, clutching her ledger of debts. She swore she could see faces rising beneath the currents, men, women, and children, pale and translucent, their eyes wide, mouths forming silent pleas. They swirled beneath the black water like suspended spirits, tethered to the river but never free. Even more unnerving were the changes in those still living on the estate. Servants who remained began murmuring phrases they had never spoken, repeating verses from old hymns or unknown chants. At night, they would stand motionless near the riverbank, staring into the black water, lips moving silently. Eleanor realized that the river did not merely take, it claimed the living as well, binding them in some unholy communion. Neighbors reported hearing the river call names from afar, names of people long dead, echoing in the fog. Those who answered the call vanished. Those who resisted often fled in terror, leaving their belongings behind, their homes abandoned. The folklore of the forgotten souls began to grow, whispered around hearths and taverns, warning children and travelers alike. Eleanor herself found no solace. Every night, she heard the low hum rising from the river, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of her mansion. She understood, with a chill that penetrated even her opulent rooms, that the spirits were patient, eternal, and that they remembered every soul she had given, and every soul she might give in the future. By winter, the Kentucky River had become a mirror of both fortune and terror. Wealth and prosperity surrounded the Ashcroft estate, yet the air was thick with unease, the waters alive with memory, the estate haunted not by ghosts, but by a river that refused to forget. And Eleanor knew, one day, the river would call again. By 1828, the Kentucky River had fully asserted its dominion over the Ashcroft estate. The locals no longer dared approach the riverbank, and travelers who strayed too close returned with tales of eerie whispers, glowing waters, and figures moving beneath the surface. Eleanor Ashcroft's wealth had reached its peak, but the price was ever more apparent. The river demanded continuous tribute, and its appetite was insatiable. The spirits began to claim more than just the lives she offered. One night, Eleanor awoke to the sound of chanting drifting across the river, low and rhythmic, carrying a cadence that penetrated even the thick walls of her mansion. She ran to the windows, peering into the mist, and saw the water rise unnaturally, forming shapes that glimmered like molten silver. Faces, those of the vanished slaves and servants, emerged briefly, mouths moving in silent supplication, before sinking again beneath the black waves. It was during this time that the first tangible signs of the river's dominion appeared on the estate itself. The grounds were littered with objects that had disappeared over the past months, a silver ladle, a child's doll, fragments of clothing, all charred or waterlogged. Their arrangement was deliberate, forming patterns reminiscent of the ledger Eleanor had once held over the river, names written in a language that was both familiar and alien. Even Eleanor herself began to feel the river's claim. Dreams plagued her. She would walk along the banks, her hands stretched toward the water, only to awaken with wet palms and the smell of iron in her room. Sometimes she awoke to find her own reflection missing from mirrors, replaced instead with the river's surface, showing glimpses of the soul she had traded. Visitors were rare, and when they came, they often fled in terror, claiming the estate was cursed, that a river spirit had mocked them. Some returned weeks later, pale and silent, haunted by something unseen that whispered their names in the night. Eleanor understood. The river had extended its reach beyond water, embedding its presence in air, earth, and memory alike. By late summer, the estate stood as both monument and prison, wealth and prosperity rising from the river's dark bargain, yet bound to the spirit's unyielding claim. The water pulsed in time with some ancient rhythm, a heartbeat that reminded Eleanor nightly of the pact she could never undo. The river had taken, and it would continue to take, until it had all it desired. By the winter of 1828, Eleanor Ashcroft felt the full weight of her bargain. Her mansion, once a symbol of refinement, had become a mausoleum of fey. The river's hum never ceased. Even behind closed doors, the sound penetrated wood and stone, rising from the black water with a pulse that matched Eleanor's own heartbeat. Every ripple seemed deliberate, each misty swirl a reminder that the spirits beneath remembered her names, her debts, and her hand in their collection. The first sign of reckoning came when her livestock fell ill overnight, despite the river's bounty. Cattle were found drowned at the riverbank, their eyes glassy, tongues blue. Crops wilted inexplicably, leaves curling into black patterns, even as gold-tinged harvests flourished elsewhere on the estate. Eleanor understood. The river's protection was conditional, and its patience had limits. Servants no longer dared speak. When they entered rooms or corridors, they whispered the river's name under their breath, bowing as if to unseen masters. Eleanor herself sometimes found her own hands raised in sleep, repeating the names of the lost, reciting verses she had never learned. Dreams of the vanished, of faces pale and lips moving silently, haunted her nights. Then one evening, she saw it, a shimmer on the river's surface that was not water, but flesh. Faces pressed to the currents, eyes burning with judgment, mouths opening in silent accusation. Eleanor fell to her knees, understanding fully that the spirits did not merely take. They remembered, they weighed, and they punished. In desperation, she attempted to reverse the pact, offering her fortune in gold, silver, and land. The river, however, remained still, unyielding. A voice, neither male nor female, whispered through the mist, "Your coin is dust. Your wealth is water. The price is life. The debt endures." Eleanor realized then that no earthly riches could undo what she had done. The river demanded balance, and the balance required souls. By dawn, the estate was silent. Eleanor sat at the riverbank, shivering, clutching the ledger of the lost. The water shimmered faintly, a subtle pulse in rhythm with her own ragged breaths. Every ripple reminded her of her choices. Every misty swirl of the river carried the weight of the lives she had bartered. The widow understood, finally, that the river's reckoning was not immediate. It was eternal. She was bound to the river, her fortune inseparable from its dark, sentient currents. And the spirits waited, patient, unyielding, remembering everything. By 1829, the Ashcroft estate had become a silent monument to a bargain that time itself could not erase. The Kentucky River continued its steady, merciless pulse, black and shimmering, carrying the memory of every soul Eleanor Ashcroft had offered. The mist clung permanently to the riverbanks, curling into shapes that resembled half-seen faces, hands, and whispers frozen in air. Travelers avoided the river entirely, speaking only in hushed tones of the widow Ashcroft and the spirits she had fed. Eleanor herself had aged unnaturally fast, her hands wrinkled and veined, her eyes sunken, yet her mind remained painfully alert. Every night, the river called her, murmuring names of the missing, chanting verses she did not recognize, pressing her to kneel and confess her debt. She understood with grim clarity that the spirit's patience was boundless, and that she was tethered to their will for as long as the river flowed. Objects began to appear on the riverbank, fragments of clothing, scorched silverware, and broken trinkets, all relics of the lives she had offered. Each item seemed deliberate, an unspoken message that the river's memory was eternal. Even the wind carried voices, soft but insistent, as if chanting alongside the water itself. The estate, though wealthy, was a prison. The servants who remained never spoke, their faces blank and pale, their hands trembling whenever the river hummed. Birds refused to roost near the water, and animals balked at crossing its banks. The river had claimed the land as much as the souls, and every heartbeat of the estate echoed the rhythm of the currents. Eleanor tried to leave, to flee across the hills of Kentucky, but every path led back to the river. The waters pulsed and shimmered, guiding her steps inexorably home. Even in her dreams, she found herself kneeling at the riverbank, ledger in hand, offering names she had long forgotten, her whispers carried beneath the misty currents. By the end, the river endured, indifferent to the passage of seasons, remembering everything, waiting patiently for the next toll. The widow Ashcroft had become one with its memory, a living testament to the price of power, wealth, and desperation. The currents pulsed with both life and death, whispering of bargains and debts, and the estate stood as an eternal witness. The Kentucky River, dark, patient, and hungry, continued to flow, forever watching, forever claiming, forever remembering. Tell me, if you lived near that river in 1826, would you have fled or joined the tide?